2 middleweight champions with 5 different categories over the course of 5 rounds. With the 10-point must system in effect, let's get straight into this and see how the new blood stacks up against the consensus middleweight GOAT. Round 1. Caliber of opponents beaten. Despite the relatively short amount of time that Israel has spent in the top flight, he has already managed to rack up an incredibly strong resume, with his standout wins coming in the form of his 2 victories over Marvin Vettori, his early TKO of Derek Brunson, as non-blonde as he was at the time, his decision victory over his rival for this video, Anderson Silva, the Fight of the Year war with Kelvin Gastelum, his initial TKO of the champion Robert Whittaker, and the narrow decision victory that followed it recently, his tactical, methodical, and some might say underwhelming victory over Yoel Romero, and finally his complete and utter drubbing of Paulo Costa. After debuting in the UFC against the 5-fight win streak carrying Chris Lieben, Silva managed to score 2 victories over the hugely underrated Rich Franklin, solid victories over Travis Lutter and Nate Marquardt both produced finishes, before a statement submission over Dan Henderson. The mid-title reign victories against Demian Maia, Thales Leites, and Patrick Cote all added to his successful defenses, but it was his finishes of Vitor Belfort, Yushin Okami, and a pair against Chael Sonnen that really produced style points. He also secured victories at 205 pounds over James Irvin, Stephan Bonner, and of course Forrest Griffin. For this opening round, I do think that the numbers favour Silva quite heavily. Sure, you could make an argument that Anderson never managed to score a win over a fighter of Robert Whittaker's quality. In reality, a direct contrast between Izzy and Silva's greatest win would be the only way that I could maybe edge this to stylebender. Adesanya has the benefit of some of his wins still being active and performing well, but when you really dig into it, Anderson Silva's 16-fight win streak has him beat. Round 2. Ability to impose strengths. This next round is one of the more important ones when it comes to a fighter's attempt to stretch out a title reign as far as he can. For Adesanya, his greatest strengths are his footwork, distance control, shot selection, ice-cold temperament, and just overall technique. Anderson, on the other hand, is a lethal finisher on the feet, a wizard in the clinch, a masterful parrier and mover of his head, a dangerous submission threat, and totally unwilling to bend in his desire to fight his fight. Adesanya, above all other things, is extremely confident on the feet so long as the fight stays there, rarely allowing his opponents to dictate the terms of the fight. Some guys like Kelvin Gastelum and Robert Whittaker were able to find success in the stand-up realm, and even Jan Blachowicz was far from out of that fight in the striking. But round by round, you will see that most fighters, with the exception of Gastelum, have their best moments when the takedowns come into play, whether as a threat or an actual successful attempt. Silva, on the other hand, while his strengths are certainly more diverse, isn't the overall striker that Israel is, although it is pretty easy to argue that he's a far more dangerous finisher. Adding to that is his black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which managed to catch the likes of Chael Sonnen and Dan Henderson out to dramatically strong results. That said, when faced with someone like Chris Weidman, who represented a new breed of middleweight athlete, he really wasn't able to impose his game on him. And while the same could indeed be said for Izzy and Jan Blachowicz, I do think that Silva, especially in the less exciting fights he had against Maia, Leites, and even Nick Diaz, was shown to be so stubborn in his approach that he would totally limit his offense if the opponent didn't play his game. Indeed, the same could be said about Adesanya in some ways. Just look at the Romero fight. But on the back of his more polished overall striking game, as well as the fact that he is completely dominant 95% of the time when the fight is standing, I will edge this slightly to Israel. But please, if you disagree, rip me to shreds in the comment section. On a quick side note, if you're enjoying this video and want to see more, subscribe to the channel now to ensure that our consistent praise for the former middleweight champion Rich Franklin doesn't continue to fall on deaf ears. Also, we recently set up a Patreon, so if you want to help support the channel, the link is in the description. Round 3. Ability to overcome weaknesses. This one will be quite interesting, and for both men there are some parallels. Adesanya's obvious weakness is his bottom game and takedown defense, even if both are still pretty decent. Against Jan Blachowicz with the size disadvantage, we saw this come into play to an even greater degree than at middleweight, because when he's fighting at 185 pounds, nobody is really controlling Izzy. Even Robert Whittaker had problems keeping him down, even if he did manage to score some vital takedowns. Silva, like Israel, would obviously prefer if the fight was standing for all 25 minutes, but unlike Izzy, he brings a very strong guard to the table, something that helped him out tremendously after succumbing to nearly 5 rounds of punishment against Chael Sonnen. But do I rate Anderson's innate finishing instinct featherweight in moments of trouble, over Adesanya's ability to avoid that happening to him in the first place as a middleweight. Indeed, his light heavyweight debut showed us some issues, and overall, I do think it's fair to say that Stylebender's unwillingness to turn up his tempo in fights with Yoel Romero and his rematch with Robert Whittaker can be called a weakness, given that his output, or lack thereof, saw him risk losing his title due to a shortcoming in the urgency department. I do think I'm going to give Anderson Silva this round on the back of his ability during his prime to keep his risk levels low for the most part, and respond emphatically when trouble did come along. His 16-fight win streak speaks volumes about how good he is in this regard, and Adesanya's loss to Blachowicz, albeit at 205 pounds, does work against him here. Round 4, pound for pound greatness. I would like to give Izzy the benefit of his low sample size across different weight classes, and in the grand scheme of his middleweight GOAT argument, probably not the most relevant thing in the world. However, I do think there is something to be said for Silva's ability to seamlessly translate his skills up 20 pounds, even if he wasn't exactly doing it against the world beaters of the division. Silva made 3 appearances at light heavyweight during his prime, beating James Irvin, Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonner with complete and total ease, each victory showcasing some serious style points. And yeah, Israel's one fight in the division saw him fall victim to a gulf in physicality between him and the champion Jan Blachowicz, a man who has more physical strength than any of the 205-pounders that Silva fought, with the exception of Daniel Cormier later on. But for what it did tell us about the route to victory against Stylebender, even if he technically faced a tougher task than any of Silva's 3 205-pound dips in his prime, I still have to give this round to Anderson. His power and finishing ability translated perfectly to light heavyweight, and the strengths to his game and his overall fighting style were more pronounced in there in ways that Izzy's simply weren't. Although if I had to guess, I would imagine that we will see great light heavyweight success in Stylebender's future. Round 5, defining moment. And finally we come to the 5th round, the category that might not be the most vital in terms of assessing one's legacy as champion, but for me, and I'm sure for a lot of you, the sport of mixed martial arts does in some way boil down to the constant desire we have as fans to witness something truly extraordinary. Something that blurs the lines between real sport and watching an action movie. And for Izzy, though his style does become a bit more conservative depending on the opponent, he certainly does have his fair share of highlight reel moments. That first round destruction of Derek Brunson that made the world fully aware of the fact that he had arrived, his 5th round rally in that instant classic against Kelvin Gastelum, his complete and total dissection of Paulo Costa. But in terms of the size of the stage and the prestige of the contest itself, I would have to say that Israel's defining moment came as he secured a 2nd round TKO against Robert Whittaker to win middleweight gold, headlining the most attended UFC event of all time. Adesanya showed up in a big way to produce a truly stellar victory against the champion. But look, maybe there is something to be said for this 5th category being absolutely made for Anderson Silva, but I do think that it does reflect more on his legacy as a finisher than anything else, and not on your humble narrator leaving something to be desired through the structure of this video. That is my defense anyway. But from his debut against Chris Lieben, his vicious plum clinch mastery against Rich Franklin, that embarrassing shutout he put on Forrest Griffin, calling Stephan Bonner over to him as he lay on the side of the cage, submitting Chael Sonnen to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It's just highlight after highlight. But for me, that front kick knockout of Vitor Belfort remains one of MMA's defining images. How he managed to cut through Belfort's traditional Thai defense with the one weapon that could perfectly find its way between his raised fists, and the way he did it completely untelegraphed from a seemingly neutral position out of nowhere. Yeah, it's a big round from the Spider to close things out. I'm not going to give it a 10-8, but it's not far off. Clear 10-9 for the middleweight GOAT. So there you have it, with a 49-46 scorecard. The victory in this one clearly goes to the former middleweight king Anderson Silva. This will come as no surprise given how much longer he spent in the UFC, in contrast to Izzy being in his relatively early days. Even still, hopefully this will give you a bit of clarity on where the current 185-pound champion is at in terms of his own standing within the middleweight GOAT argument. I know that Israel himself has made it clear that he is not chasing the records held by Anderson, but I guess I just wanted to make a video like this for the sheer hell of it. Keeping things experimental, folks, as always. All in the name of good fun. Maybe in the future I could do something similar for other fighters in comparable situations, so do let us know in the comments section below if there are any changes you would make in the formula I've outlined. And also if you have any suggestions for a future video featuring 2 new fighters. But how would you score this pairing over 5 rounds under my criteria? Do let us know your opinions in the comments section below. We always love to hear from you guys. Remember to subscribe to the channel to stay up to date with all of our latest uploads. Patreon link can be found in the description. Thank you for watching.